some things which the world considers of literary value, but which, because of their ability to cause little ones to stumble, we are better off leaving them alone until a mature age, or in some cases, perhaps just leaving them alone altogether. The world's values cannot be our values. So here are a few of the principles which we have developed in our own family in order to discern which literature to redeem and which to burn. First of all, do what is pleasing to the Lord, that ye might walk worthy of the Lord in all pleasing, being fruitful in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God. Colossians 1:10. If you go places you ought not go, and see things you ought not see, and hear things you ought not hear, you'll end up doing things you ought not do. We can hear someone say, oh, well, wait a minute, the Bible is full of descriptions of wicked deeds of men. True, but the Bible also tells you what to think about all that wickedness. And the Bible is not particularly graphic in its description of depravity. Nevertheless, there are sections of the Bible which we simply do not read to young children. For example, the Hebrews would not allow anyone to read the Song of Solomon until he was of a mature age. Not that the Song of Solomon is wicked, but that some of the material is definitely rated PG, parental guidance. We must not cause little ones to stumble over things which they simply are not prepared to handle. For example, one of the great Greek tragic dramatists was Sophocles, and his writings reflect his sexually perverse and immoral life. Sigmund Freud appropriated the plot of one of his plays, Oedipus Rex, for his own perverse theories of sexuality. Okay, a second principle is do not follow the world and be not conformed to this world, Romans 12:2. Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to keep himself unspotted from the world, James 1:27. We do not need to adopt the world's values and standards in order to fit in and to prove to the world that we are not inferior. We are not looking for their friendship or approval. We must not allow the world to define us. If we are Christians, then we must allow the world to allow the Lord to define us and all that we do as we seek to please Him. We must not decline to define all things from a Christian perspective. If a piece of literature cannot be used to build Christian culture in our children, then no matter how neutral it may appear, it will nevertheless be used to build something culturally anti-Christian in our children. Why? Because to be neutral toward Christ is not to be Christian. The compromise of neutrality takes the life out of commitment to Christ. The world wants to be our friend, but only on their terms, which includes spotting and defiling us with ungodliness and worldly lusts. We must guard ourselves from being corrupted by their standards. Proverbs 4:23, keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life.
Okay, the comedy plays of Aristophanes would be an example of defiling material full of numerous perverse topics. I don't know if you've heard of Aristophanes. They might be compared to R-rated stand-up comedy routines of today. Even the pagan Plutarch criticized Aristophanes' plays as disgusting and degrading. But we can make some better choices. For example, many people assume that if we want to study ancient Egyptian history, then we need to require our children to read such pieces of literature as the Book of the Dead or the Hymns to the Nile. These two sources are considered standards in the study of Egyptian literature. And here are some better choices. You'll see on the overhead, we list some ancient Egyptian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and Persian literature, which are good representatives of literature for these ancient cultures and which can be safely read to children. For example, the Egyptian Precepts, the letter of Pepi II, Pharaoh Amenhotep II as a sportsman, Ramesses at Kadesh, the Code of Hammurabi, Sargon's capture of Samaria. I'm going to read to you an excerpt from one of those. It's the letter of Pepi II concerning a dwarf. Now, Pepi II ruled as a pharaoh of Egypt for many years, beginning when he was just a very small child. The following letter was written by Pepi when he was 9 years old, and he wrote it to Harkuf, which was a caravan leader. Harkuf had made a journey into Nubia and had earlier written to Pepi describing a dancing dwarf he was bringing back to Egypt. And I quote from Pepi, "You have said in your letter that you have come down in safety from Yam with the army and brought many beautiful gifts. You also say in this letter that you have brought a dwarf of divine dances from the land of the horizon dwellers. Each year you do what your Lord desires, spending day and night with the caravan. Now, come northward at once to the court. You must bring the dwarf alive, sound, and well to rejoice and gladden the heart. When he comes down with you into the ship, appoint reliable people who shall be beside him on each side of the vessel and take care lest he should fall into the water. When he sleeps at night, appoint trustworthy people who shall sleep beside him. Inspect him 10 times a night, because my majesty desires to see this dwarf more than all the products of Sinai and fruit."
Okay, a third principle. We ask, will reading this advance our education? 1 Corinthians 10:23, all things are lawful for me, but not all things do edify. To edify means to build up, to promote proper constructive growth. Some things do not promote healthy growth. Indeed, some things promote perverted growth. It may serve some edifying purpose at a mature age to be aware of some perversions, but it is never edifying to dwell upon and explore the depths of depravity. Proverbs 4:14 and 15, enter not into the path of the wicked, and go not in the way of evil men. Avoid it, pass not by it, turn from it, and pass away. Ephesians 5:11, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them, for it is a shame even to speak of those things which are done of them in secret. There is some literature which, if it is to be read, particularly by children, then it must be expurgated. Expurgated means that the graphic obscenities are purged out, either in the text itself or else by the parent who reads the text aloud to the children. Though the Greek and Roman historians, biographers, and geographers such as Herodotus and Livy and Plutarch and Diogenes Laertius, they must be read if you want any idea of ancient history. Nevertheless, now and then you will find passages in these works that will make you blush.
I want to make an important point here. When you're studying ancient Greek and Roman history, we believe that the Greek and Roman historians, biographers, and geographers are very important to read. But all Greek and Roman literature needs to be pre-read by the parent. Most all of these authors are generally not offensive, but occasionally they will interject something which you'll likely want to skip. So we recommend that all ancient Greek and Roman writers should be pre-read by the parent. Polybius, he was a Greek historian who lived around 200 BC. It was during the Roman conquest of Greece. He wrote about the period of Roman history from the outbreak of the First Punic War to the destruction of Carthage. And here's an interesting passage from book 6, section 5. I quote, "Now the natural laws which regulate the transformation of one form of government into another are perhaps discussed with greater accuracy by Plato and some other philosophers. But their treatment, from its intricacies and exhaustiveness, is within the capacity of only a few. I will therefore endeavor to give a summary of the subject, just so far as I suppose it to fall within the scope of a serious history and the intelligence of ordinary people." So apparently it isn't only 21st century students of Greek history who have a hard time understanding Plato. Nicholas of Damascus was a Greek historian and philosopher who lived around the 1st century AD. And he wrote a book called The Life of Augustus, and in sections 19 to 22, we find a possible first-hand account, and perhaps the only one we have, of the murder of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. Quintus Curtius was a mid-1st century AD Roman biographer of Alexander the Great, and this is the only work on Alexander in Latin which has come down to us. And his work is pretty easy to read. You could read this, 10-year-old could understand this. I want to read to you a passage in his History of Alexander. Now in this narrative, Alexander the Great was laying siege to the city of Tyre, which is a city on the Mediterranean coast. And he was about ready to give up the siege and retreat, but he decided on one last try, and I quote here. Therefore, in order to leave nothing untried, he ordered more ships to be brought up, and the best of his soldiers to be embarked upon them. And it chanced that a sea monster of a size never before seen, rising even above the waves with its back, brought its huge body up to the causeway which the Macedonians had built, and striking the surges asunder as it lifted itself, was seen by both sides. Then from the peak of the causeway it again plunged into the sea, and now rising above the surface with a great part of its bulk, now hidden as the waves dashed over it, it disappeared under the water not far from the walls of the city. Julian the Apostate, he was an emperor of Rome from around 360 AD, and he was raised as a Christian, but only pretended to be a Christian. And when he became the emperor of Rome, he tried to repress Christian privileges and to restore Rome's ancient pagan culture. We have several letters that have come down to us that he wrote. Letter 42 is an edict. It's very interesting. It's an edict against Christian teachers of the classics and against Christians studying the classics. Letter 49 is Julian's own words concerning his attitude towards the Christians and pagans. Priscus, he was born in the early 5th century AD. He wrote in Greek a history in 8 books, but we only have fragments of his books that remain to us today. In fragment 8, he records a visit that he made in 448 AD to the court of Attila the Hun, and he gives a picture of the Huns, which is different from other sources.
Okay, a fourth principle. Does this material have lasting value? 1 Corinthians 7:31. And they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. Only those things which honor the Lord are of lasting value. Everything else is going to pass away. It is true that the Lord uses all things, even stupid things and evil things, to serve his purposes. But this is no excuse for stupidity and evil. It may be true that we should become more clever in developing the means to redeem things for the Lord's use. Nevertheless, if we cannot redeem something for the Lord's use, then we ought to abandon the use of it. If something cannot serve biblical goals, then it will eventually work to undermine biblical foundations by pursuing other worldly goals. Remember this principle. There is no non-partisan position. Either you acknowledge God or you don't. If something does not honor God, then ultimately it dishonors him by ignoring him. The notion of neutrality is a smokescreen used to cover up a most effective means of opposition, namely attrition, which is wearing down and finally exhausting an opponent, in this case by making him run around in ostensibly neutral circles. For example, the fact that God is never honored in government education subconsciously taught us that there is no God. That's what I was taught. I was an atheist until I went to college. The Lord converted me. You see, the government education is not really neutral. It's just subtle.
Here's an example of what we mean. Some of the speeches of Pericles and Demosthenes are significant examples of historical, political, and rhetorical content. Pericles' funeral speech is a valuable statement about Athenian democracy in the 5th century. And Demosthenes was a Greek orator who lived in the 4th century BC. Demosthenes differed from Isocrates in that Isocrates looked for some leader who could unify and lead Greece, and he believed that Philip of Macedon, who was the father of Alexander the Great, would best fit this role, while Demosthenes was sort of an ancient Rush Limbaugh, and he saw Philip as a barbarian.
Ancient Rush Limbaugh. Our fifth principle is, when in doubt, leave it out. Romans 14:23, for whatsoever is not of faith is sin. Like the stuff which has been in the refrigerator for a long time and it doesn't look or smell quite right, when in doubt, throw it out. If we proceed with genuine doubt, then we do not proceed from the principle of faith, and we injure our own conscience. Honestly resolve doubts before proceeding. Life is too short and things are too many to be fretting over a few little things which, if we discover they are really so important, we can always pick them up later. Perhaps when we're more prepared to handle them. We never reach the point where we say, well, there's just nothing to do. There are just plain too many things to do, and we might relish the opportunity to eliminate something. Now, whether or not you agree with our understanding of these principles, you should agree to the value of establishing some principles. Parents are also subject to peer pressure, including classical homeschooling peer pressure. As someone shares his long list of classics which his children are reading, then don't begin to doubt or fret. Just look back at your own list of principles and stick to them. Require your child to read those classical works which agree with your family's principles, and don't fret the rest. Now, where to draw the line with regard to appropriate ages? What things are appropriate at what age levels? The Scriptures repeatedly draw the line between the worship of the true God and all other religion. Little children are not held accountable for this kind of knowledge because they cannot fully understand it. Parents are held accountable for what they teach their children. Causing one of these little ones to stumble will be a major offense. Because of the continual warnings to Israel to leave no knowledge of false gods in the land, we must understand that how to deal with the knowledge of false gods is no small matter in God's eyes. We must understand the principles and apply them carefully. There is no one-size-fits-all way of looking at this. Different families are at different levels of cultural maturity, and they will handle different things differently. And some families are more frequently assaulted with different points of view. There should, however, be some common lines of demarcation.
Number one, different age levels can handle different levels of difficulty. For example, works written in simpler language would include the Education of Cyrus the Great, written by the Greek historian Xenophon, or the Antiquities of the Jews, written by the Jewish historian Josephus. Now, a more difficult work would be the History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. Aulus Gellius was a Roman author and grammarian. He lived in 123 AD. And his only work that has come down to us is called Attic Nights, and it's a collection of entertaining essays on grammar, geometry, philosophy, history, biography, and nearly every other branch of knowledge. I want to read to you an excerpt from Gellius's Attic Nights, and it's very easy to understand. A 10-year-old could understand his works. And I quote, Tubero, in his histories, has recorded that in the First Punic War, the consul Attalus Regulus, when encamped by the Vagatus River in Africa, fought a stubborn and fierce battle with a single serpent of extraordinary size, which had its lair in that region. That in a mighty struggle with the entire army, the reptile was attacked for a long time with hurling engines and catapults, and that when it was finally killed, its skin, 120 feet long, was sent to Rome. Now, the reason I read this rather obscure and little-known excerpt is to show you that not all ancient Greek and Roman literature is boring and hard to understand, like Plato and Aristotle. There are some very interesting and valuable pieces among these authors, especially among the historians.
Secondly, different children can handle different materials. The philosophical works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Lucretius, Philo, Marcus Aurelius, and so forth should be left for mature Christians with a firm grounding in the faith. Aristotle's scientific and historical works may be read by anyone aged 12 and up. Cicero's historical, oratorical, and rhetorical works can be read by anyone aged 12 and up. Thirdly, nothing should engender an improper or ungodly appetite. Of course, all literature which ignores God engenders an appetite for literature which leaves the true God out of the picture. But this is always the way of the world, and you'll have to develop your own strategies for dealing with this. We can draw a sharper line between certain kinds of literature. The ancient poetry of Homer and Hesiod, and the plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides and the Roman plays may easily engender an appetite for mythology and all of the perverted notions which accompany that. The fables of Aesop and Avianus have their value, though we must always keep in mind that the lessons which they teach must be rerooted in God's Word, or else their authority will rest in man and in nature, which which is misleading. Fourth, the explicit description of acts of degenerate depravity must be omitted. Mythology is filled with degeneracy, but so are the plays and the poetry. The plays of Terence, the Roman, focus on love intrigues of very doubtful morality. Do you happen to have a copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses in your house? We suggest that you put it on a very high shelf. Ovid was banished from Rome because of the extreme immorality of his poem Ars Amatoria, or The Art of Lovemaking. About 1 out of 5 of the writings of the Roman name Martial are absolutely obscene. There is much more that can be said on this subject, and we have a book called Our Ancient History from Primary Sources, which surveys literature to the end of the Roman Empire, and it gives you some guidance with regard to this. You'll talk about this just a little bit more in a minute. Okay, now you may have encountered the argument, well, wait a minute, Christians should plunder the Egyptians and other pagans for their treasures. This would make Christians, as it were, raiders of the lost arts, with apologies to Harrison Ford. Well, we certainly agree with this principle. The wealth of the sinner is laid up for the righteous, Proverbs 13:22. God, in His providence, causes the wicked to labor and to store, then He delivers their labors over to the righteous. This happens with individuals as well as with nations. The nation Israel came into the promised land and took over the Canaanite civilization. We read, to give thee great and goodly cities which thou buildest not, and houses full of all good things which thou fillest not, and wells digged which thou diggest not, vineyards and olive trees which thou plantest not. It is important to note, however, that when they took possession of the land, they were commanded to culturally clean up. I read this earlier. You shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you and destroy all their pictures and destroy all their molten images and quite pluck down all their high places. In other words, the Israelites were to keep certain useful items of physical culture, built cities and filled houses and dug wells and planted vineyards and orchards, but they were to make a clean separation from their intellectual and social culture, matters of worship, and idols made of precious metals and family relations. Augustine of Hippo said, if those who are called philosophers, and especially the Platonists, have said anything which is true and in harmony with our faith, then we are not only not to shrink from it, but we are to claim it for our own use from those who have no lawful possession of it. Now, though we agree with Augustine that all truth is our lawful possession as Christians, we must be careful about what we claim as our property. In the framework of their false worldview, the Platonists said absolutely nothing that was true. It is only within the framework of faith, the biblical worldview, that anything can be said to be true, because it is the framework which gives ultimate meaning to everything. We must take the statements of Platonists and remove them from the darkness of humanist mythology, and we must place them under the light of biblical revelation. We must not love pagan literature for its own beauty, because its own beauty appears only in its own light, which is actually darkness. Only what is redeemed and displayed in Christian light is truly beautiful. We are by no means saying that we must avoid all Greek and Roman literature. We are only saying that if we are going to plunder Egypt, then we must do just that. We shouldn't be picking over Egypt for every last crumb, but we should be writing off with the precious metals and jewels. Not everyone will draw the line at the same place, but everybody must draw the line at some place. Tertullian was considered a brilliant defender of the Christian faith and a Christian rhetorician of the highest order. He wrote, "What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy," that's the philosophy of Plato, "and the church? Away with all attempts to produce a modeled Christianity of Stoic, Platonic, and dialectic composition." This was the common opinion among apologists of his day. But this did not keep Tertullian or Justin Martyr or Lactantius and many other apologists from alluding to the philosophers and the poets. Yet they were always careful how they used these things.
All right, I want to go over an outline for evaluating historical documents, just talk a little bit about that, the value of primary sources. Perhaps the most important part in determining the trustworthiness of an historical account is knowing how far the writer or the historian was removed from the event. In other words, is he a primary or a secondary source? As Ken Ham would say it, was he there? A primary source is a direct link between us and someone or something which was actually present when the event, which